So I will try to, last speaker, last panel. So first of all, thanks for having me. And my presentation is going to be a little bit different because it's not about Gavi in and of itself, which is where I'm from, which is, in many ways inherently a multi-sectoral partnership. But I was asked to talk about what we did with something called an advance purchase commitment for the Ebola vaccine. So just quickly to give the background, I think everybody here knows that Ebola has been around for quite a long time. And, it first made an appearance in 1976. But the numbers of people that were getting infected were very low, partially because you just basically had an immediate death sentence. And so the numbers back then were much smaller, and there really wasn't a commercial viability for any kind of vaccine at that time. And then what we saw around the time of September 11th, the scare around Ebola became much more because, again, there was this idea of Ebola becoming a bioweapon. And there were a lot of efforts, actually, at that point to start creating a vaccine, and the U.S. and other countries started investing more in the idea of a vaccine and drugs in case of an attack. But unfortunately, it didn't stick. I think, what we have seen with Ebola in many diseases where there's a lot of excitement and scare, and then it goes away, and then it drops. But then came 2014 with the West African outbreak, and that was by far the biggest we had ever seen in those three countries. We saw almost 30,000 cases of Ebola, with almost a little under 12,000 deaths in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. And so it really was with that outbreak that I think the attention rose again. And what we saw was with the Ebola outbreak, we saw immunization drop dramatically in those three countries, actually by 50%. And kids were dying of diseases that, there were access to vaccines for. And so basically, when all of this was happening, the executive board of our organization really felt it was important to do something about it. And it was something different. We committed funding for things that we do on, strengthening health systems, allowing countries to reprogram their health systems grants to start building the immunization system again. But what we also did was allocate money to both procure a licensed Ebola vaccine. But there wasn't one that actually existed. And so that's really where we came up with this idea of an advance purchase commitment. And the reason we did this was, again, in the years past, there were there were a number, I think 10 actually candidates, but they just hadn't moved. And so the idea is could we create an incentive for companies to actually continue their development and move toward a licensed vaccine? So we had three main goals in mind. The first was we needed to ensure that if there was another outbreak for Ebola, that there was a vaccine that would be available. Even if it wasn't licensed, if it was proven to be effective, that countries could access it in order to prevent the kind of infections and deaths we had seen in 2014. We also wanted to incentivize the manufacturers to continue their development of the vaccine. And then finally, the goal was to ensure that once we had a licensed vaccine, that we could actually create a stockpile for that vaccine so that when there were outbreaks, the countries could have access. And so in order to achieve that goal, we offered something called an advance purchase commitment to those manufacturers that had an Ebola vaccine in progress in clinical development. And the deal is that they had to we provided basically a prepayment of $5 million, saying that once we have a licensed vaccine, we will absolutely at least purchase $5 million of that vaccine. But in return, it was critical for the company to, one, make sure that there was enough vaccine available at all times in case there was an outbreak in country. The second was to ensure that they would submit for these vaccines to be used in emergency settings. And the third was, at some point continuing that development and then applying for licensure. So it was, in our view, we were trying to send a signal to manufacturers that there is a market here for a licensed Ebola vaccine. So in 2015, we approved an APC with Merck, where, again, we would pay them $5 million as a credit for a licensed vaccine. And in return, they would keep 300,000 doses of the vaccine available at all times. And there would always be 100,000 products ready to go, filled and finished, so that if there was an outbreak, countries could access it as quickly as possible. And then the third thing that the APC required was that Merck would apply to the WHO for approval to use the vaccine in a public health emergency, but also work to apply for licensure. And the one thing I'll say is, in addition to that $5 million, actually the U.S. government was the one sovereign donor that actually committed funding to support an Ebola stockpile once the vaccine was licensed, and that was at a level of $20 million. So talking about the stakeholders in this process. So obviously we at Gavi were the ones who, created the APC, but we played, there were a number of people that played roles in this partnership working. First, UNICEF was a part in creating that initial expression of interest and really ensuring that Gavi was able to have a conversation with the various manufacturers about what they were doing and the timelines they were under. Second was obviously the pharmaceutical industry, vaccine manufacturers, given that they were the ones who actually had the product. And then obviously working with WHO, where they were reviewing the applications with the manufacturers to ensure that the vaccine could be used in emergency settings, but also making recommendations for vaccine use once it was in fact licensed. And then UNICEF obviously is also again involved because they are our procurement agency. And so once we have a licensed vaccine, they will be working to procure the vaccine for us. And then I would say the other, we have implementing partners who are working on the ground in ensuring that the vaccine could be used in emergency situations. I know I'm running out of time. But I think it's also really important to mention the country governments. The country governments weren't necessarily part of the APC in and of itself, but they obviously play a huge role, and we're seeing that in the outbreak in DRC right now, where they've really shown tremendous leadership in coordinating and managing the response activities. So quickly on successes and challenges. So look, I think the biggest success is we actually have a vaccine that's being used in areas where there are outbreaks. We know that there was an outbreak earlier this year in DRC that actually was able to get contained. The one that we're seeing right now has not been as easy and has been actually quite difficult given the security issues that we have in that area. I think the other success was that, making rapid detection and knowing that the outbreak was there was critical. I think, again, DRC really did a very good job in ensuring that they were able to use their laboratories to, to basically say when the outbreak was happening. But there's also been challenges. Vaccine development during an outbreak response is, it's not easy. In order to do these trials, there has to be an outbreak, and so when you're trying to get clearance for these things, you can only do it when there's an outbreak there's an outbreak happening. And I think the other big challenge is also, reactive versus preemptive use, and what does this mean for the manufacturer? Because at some point, the manufacturer needs to, have some amount that they have to produce. And if you're only doing it for reactive use, there's only it's not really sustainable for manufacturers. And so, it's really important to ensure that there's that balance between ensuring that there's enough volume available and that's viable for manufacturers. And then finally, what we learned was that the vaccine is actually not a silver bullet. It has made a huge difference in the places where it's been used, and it's obviously got very high efficacy. But it's really only part of the response. And, if people are infected, they can't be vaccinated. And so, it's critical for controlling the outbreak, but it really has to be done in conjunction with other preventative and disease control measures. And I am going to stop there since I'm over time, and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Not too bad. All right, thank you.